Hello, it's Aaron. Welcome back to the podcast. There's a lot of controversies going on around higher education, to say the least, as well as a lot of efforts to reform higher ed. And maybe the epicenter for the latter has been the state of Florida, where there has been a lot going on with the state schools under the leadership of Governor Ron DeSantis. And I'm very delighted today to have someone here to talk about that. That is Dr. Jason Jewell, who is the Chief Academic Officer of the State University System of Florida. So, Dr. Jewell, thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yes, and he's just in full disclosure, he's someone I've known for a while and has been a reader of my work, and that's how we connected. And it's been a privilege getting to know you a little bit there, Jason.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I've enjoyed reading your material. And I think I reviewed your book for an online publication when it came out last year. So I've enjoyed the relationship.
You spent about 20 years, maybe more than 20 years, as a professor at Faulkner University in Atlanta. So, how did you end up getting this new job in Florida?
Yeah, so first of all, slight correction. Faulkner is in Montgomery, Alabama, and I was there for a little bit over 20 years. I was hired there right after finishing my PhD at Florida State. So I did have some Florida in my background, but I was a department chair in humanities there at Faulkner. And for about the last 10 years that I was there, I directed graduate programs that had an online presence and students from all over the country that were, the programs were great books based. And so I leveraged that into starting a center at Faulkner called the Center for Great Books and Human Flourishing, and did some fundraising to support that. In the process of developing that center, I did a lot of traveling and I attended a lot of conferences, got to know a lot of people in kind of the academic orbit of some of the civic centers that had been popping up at some of the major state universities around the country, like Arizona State and later University of Tennessee at Knoxville, and getting to know a lot of people at a lot of these kind of right of center organizations like the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and institutions like that. So I had developed a decent professional network, I guess you could say, over the course of 7 or 8 years. And then there was a job posting here in Florida for the Board of Governors office. The Board of Governors is a body that's appointed by Governor DeSantis, and there's a staff, a full-time staff that supports those appointed members. So it's a very small state agency, but it has authority given to it by the Florida Constitution over the state university system, which is very large, of course. It's 12 universities, hundreds of thousands of students, a multi-billion-dollar budget every year. And I had a lot of people in my network encouraging me to apply for this position in the Board of Governors office. And so I didn't know anybody at the agency, but based on the feedback I was getting from folks that I knew who thought I would be a good fit for that position, I applied and ended up getting interviewed in November and then offered this job, which was a new position that the office had created in December. So I left my faculty position in the middle of the academic year. My new boss, Chancellor Ray Rodriguez, had offered me the option of staying on at Faulkner through the end of the academic year, knowing that I probably had contractual obligations to the university. But I wanted to come on down as soon as I could because this was after the presidential election. I knew that the first half of 2025 was likely going to be, a lot of moving pieces and a lot of action, both nationally and at the state level. And so I was able to make arrangements with my university to leave in the middle of the academic year and move my family down to Tallahassee. So I started in January, and it's been a great experience so far.
So, the Board of Governors is over the whole state university system. And my understanding is each university has its own board of trustees that is the governing board of that university. So, you're not the chief academic officer or provost or whatever you say of any particular university in the state. So what is the role that you have with regards to state education or state university system in Florida?
Yeah, that's right. Florida has what some people call a hybrid system where, as you said, each individual university has its own trustees, and then the Board of Governors oversees the whole system. So I run point on a number of different things here at the state agency. I am a point of contact for the provosts and the academic vice presidents at the different institutions in the system. So I'm on a monthly Zoom call with those folks to talk about current concerns, along with our vice chancellor of academic and student affairs. We both are on that call with the provosts and answering their questions about things that are happening. Sometimes things happening in the legislature, sometimes interpretations of regulations that the Board of Governors has put on its books. And so I'm a liaison for those academic vice presidents. I'm also I also have responsibilities for handling things related to academics and curriculum specifically, because the legislature here in Florida has passed some major reform legislation in the last couple of years dealing with the general education curriculum. And now every course that an individual university in our system wants to have counted in its general education curriculum has to be reviewed and approved by our office here in Tallahassee. And so that was part of a larger uh, SB 266 is the name of the legislation that was passed in 2023. It was a kind of a comprehensive higher ed reform bill that did a number of things that was similar to the Stop Woke Act in 2022, which focused more on the K-12 system. But SB 266 prohibited universities from spending any state or federal funds on DEI. And there was an effort to get what were considered ideological concepts, divisive concepts, indoctrinating concepts out of the general education curriculum. And so now one of my responsibilities is reviewing those courses that the universities say they want to have count for general education. And I have to make sure they're in compliance with that legislation. In addition to being the chief academic officer, I have another title, which is vice chancellor for strategic initiatives. And that's where I'm responsible for collecting and presenting to the rest of the senior leadership team here at the agency ideas for further policy changes or policy reforms. So I'm also a liaison with a number of think tanks, and I'm always talking to folks in the public policy world about ideas that they have for higher education and where some of the problems are that could be addressed effectively with further public policy reform, either regulatory or legislative. So I'm constantly in meetings with those folks and presenting those ideas to the chancellor and the other staff here to see whether we think certain ideas are viable, whether we could move forward with them and maybe make them part of future legislative sessions here in Florida.
Yeah, you mentioned a state law that made some reforms to curriculum in the state. Just in general, what has Governor DeSantis been trying to accomplish with higher ed in Florida?
Yeah, you probably remember Aaron on election night in 2022 after he won in a landslide, won re-election. Of course, he was elected governor in 2018 by a very narrow margin, and then had a blowout win in 2022, winning 60% of the vote. And in his victory speech that night, he said, "We've sent the message that Florida is where woke goes to die." And so, of course, that's been a major theme of his tenure as governor, is trying to get the woke out of the educational system. And as I mentioned a minute ago, the Stop Woke Act in 2022 was the first big salvo in that effort. There was a lot of that was the law that kind of led to a showdown with the Disney Corporation, which you probably remember being in the news, where Disney
Hmm.
dedicated themselves to trying to get that legislation repealed. Thus far, they've failed in doing that. And all of that, of course, was part of the fallout of the online school during COVID, when a lot of parents got really upset at being exposed to what exactly was being taught in their children's classrooms when they were at home, um, getting taught over the video screen, and parents were hearing these teachers in the background, uh, teaching them problematic things. So that effort got extended to higher education in 2023. And whenever you see the governor get on stage, do a press conference, anything related to education reform, he'll always put that sort of woke DEI kind of spin on whatever it is that he's talking about, because that's kind of been his bread and butter. Of course, there are a lot of other things about the educational system that need reforming that don't necessarily have anything to do with wokeness or DEI. And so here at the agency and in our conversations with the legislators, we're always looking at a number of different things related to bureaucratic bloat and efficiency and sound pedagogy and all those kinds of things. That's not the kind of thing that the governor usually talks about when he gets in front of the cameras, but we're always working on all those other things as well. And a lot of these initiatives, of course, are kind of multifaceted, and they have a lot of different moving pieces to them. But that's not what you'll normally see getting covered by the press, because they're focused on the governor and whatever he happens to be saying about wokeness at the moment.
Hmm. A lot of the national press conference coverage about higher ed in Florida had to do with things like the new College of Florida reboot, I guess you'd say, where the governor replaced the board of trustees, and they're now trying to be more like a Hillsdale of the South kind of thing, if that's fair to say. And then, of course, the University of Florida recently put forward a nominee for president, a preferred candidate that the board of governors rejected, and so that was in the news. But there's a lot, as you say, going on under the hood, and I want to talk about some of the stuff that hasn't maybe been covered as much. The one that I found most interesting is a recent initiative to create a new accrediting agency for colleges. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so accreditation is not something that a lot of people have spent much time thinking about if they are not working full time in higher ed. But it's really a critical piece of how higher ed operates in this country, for a couple of reasons. First of all, if your college or university is not accredited by an organization that is officially recognized by the US Department of Education, then your students at your college cannot receive federal financial aid. So they're not eligible for Pell Grants, they're not eligible for the Stafford Loan Program, for example. And because most colleges and universities are very dependent on tuition for their annual operating expenses, if their students don't have access to that financial aid, that kind of kneecaps them. So that's one reason the accreditors act sort of as gatekeepers for the Title IV federal financial aid for an institution's students. But then going beyond that, if your institution is not accredited, it can be very difficult for your students to transfer their credits to another institution if they decide that they can't end up graduating from your institution. They need to transfer somewhere else. They might not be able to move those credits over if your school is not accredited. And then finally, there are a number, most graduate schools that are out there. If you get a bachelor's degree from an unaccredited institution, it might be very difficult for you to get admission into a graduate program at an institution that is accredited. So there's a number of things that will really handicap a school if they don't have accreditation, regardless of any other benefits that accreditation might bring, in the sense of encouraging your institution to be holding itself to high standards for academics, and being financially responsible, and all those other things that accreditation is supposed to measure. So historically in the United States, there have been about half a dozen institutional accreditors that essentially formed a kind of cartel in the United States. Each one of them was regionally based, And here in the Southeast, there are about 10 or 12 states that if you wanted that access to the federal financial aid, you had to be accredited by what the acronym is SACS-COC, the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges. And that was really your only option. And so you had to abide by whatever standards SACS-COC had decided to establish for institutions that it was going to accredit. And if you were in the Midwest, for example, the regional monopoly there was the Higher Learning Commission. And then in other parts of the country, there were other regional accreditors. Well, there was a major, I mean, it wasn't really remarked on much at the time, but it ended up being a major reform put in place by the first Trump administration. In 2019 and 2020, a process was set in place that resulted in eliminating that geographical distinction. So for the first time, colleges and universities had the option of maybe going to get accredited by a different one of these 6 accreditors. Now, pretty quickly, those 6 accreditors all sort of seemed to have kind of a gentleman's agreement that they would not be poaching schools from each other, so to speak. And this was a problem for legislators in Florida
Isn't that the
because for many
definition of a
years,
cartel?
a cartel is a group of
Yeah,
institutions that exercise control over a given segment
yeah.
in the market,
Kind of sounds like a
and
cartel to me.
cartels. Yeah, they're all kind of enforced by the state ultimately. This was kind of a a linchpin of fascist economies, Mussolini's Italy and so on. But functionally, these accreditors did function as a cartel because that was the only way to get access to these federal loan dollars for your students. But in Florida, there had been this kind of contentious relationship with the regional accreditor, with SACS-COC, going back more than 10 years. And uh, from the perspective of the governor, and this wasn't just Governor DeSantis, this stretched back to previous administrations and legislatures, but going back for more than a decade, there had been this sense that the accreditor had been interfering with the governance of the state universities and trying to, um, in some cases, even maybe discouraging the state universities and colleges from abiding by certain elements of state law and things like that. So that's kind of an intolerable thing if you're in the legislature. And a few years ago, the legislature passed a bill, which Governor DeSantis signed, that required all Florida colleges and universities to leave SACS-COC now that the geographical monopoly on accreditation had ended. Well, it turns out that of all the other institutions, all the other accreditors in the country, only one of them indicated a willingness to accept Florida's institutions. And that was the Higher Learning Commission, which historically has been operating primarily in the Midwest. So over the last few years, Florida's colleges and universities have started the process of moving over to the Higher Learning Commission. And that's been fine up to now. We think that the Higher Learning Commission has very good leadership, that there's not been any pressure put on our schools to try to implement things that are contrary to state law, such as Higher Learning Commission doesn't try to push DEI onto the schools, which is now prohibited by Florida statute, for example. But the chancellor here and key legislators were also concerned, knowing that the current leadership of the Higher Learning Commission won't be around forever. That there's probably going to be a change there in the next 8 to 10 years. And there was a desire to try to establish some other kind of option for Florida schools if the broader accrediting environment ever became more inhospitable to us. So in the last legislative session, Florida's legislature set aside $4 million eventually to help start a new accreditor. But those plans didn't really come to fruition until just recently, within the last month or two, when we had put together a consortium of university systems from 6 states altogether. So we've got systems in Florida, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, North Carolina, and South Carolina all have agreed to come together to form a new accreditor called the Commission for Public Higher Education. Now, this is the reason why we had to do this consortium arrangement, is that it's prohibited by federal law that a single state accredits its own universities. So that would not have been an option. But the interpretation of that statute leaves open the possibility that a consortium of states could act in that way. So we've got a number of different states, all of which had formerly been accredited by SAC-COC, and all of which had a number of problems with that accreditor in the past and were looking for another option. Conversations started, I think, sometime last year, even before I came on staff here at the Board of Governors, to say, what would this look like? How could we start something like this? And then pretty soon after I came on staff, I was involved in kind of informal meetings with representatives from these other systems to try to hash out, what this might look like. And we got it to a point where by June, the governor was ready to go out and make an announcement, and this became big news in the higher ed world. We still had other hurdles to overcome. Just earlier this month, 2 weeks ago, basically, the Board of Governors formally voted to approve the creation of this entity. So this Commission for Public Higher Education, the CPHE is the acronym, is going to be created as a 501c3 with the Board of Governors as the sole member of that corporation initially, but then it will delegate the operating authority of the corporation to a board of directors, which will include members from all of these 6 founding university systems. And I'm the person who was designated to be Florida's representative on the board of directors. So I'll be very involved with that going forward. But we have a lot to do to get this set up and running. There is probably a minimum 2 years that we have to be engaged in actual accrediting activity before we can apply for full recognition to the federal Department of Education. Until we get that recognition, we can't be the gatekeepers for that federal financial aid. So there's kind of a chicken and egg situation there. How do you persuade institutions to be accredited by you if you can't provide that gatekeeping function on behalf of their students? But we have a number of public institutions, and we are limiting the activities of this accreditor to public institutions. It won't be accrediting any private schools. But a lot of these schools, not just in our 6 states that ended up founding this, but also in a number of other states who have already expressed interest in being part of the initial cohorts, because they see there's going to be a lot of opportunities for streamlining this process. Accreditation can be a very cumbersome process for institutions. I was speaking to the director of institutional assessment for one of the largest schools here in the state university system, and he said every time they went through one of these reaffirmation cycles, which had to be done basically every 5 years, they would have to spend millions of dollars generating the reports and collecting all the data and everything that the accreditor was demanding, much of which they didn't think was really necessary to demonstrate that they were doing what they were supposed to be doing and working towards, making progress towards fulfilling their mission and all that sort of thing. So we're very hopeful that we're going to be able to set up a much better process for public institutions that will minimize the kind of duplication of efforts that they have to do currently to satisfy both the state government that they're under, and then also the accreditor, which often is making them do things that they shouldn't really have to do. I could go on about that for a long time, but I think your listeners would start tearing their hair out if I went much further. So I'll pause there. But the bottom line is, this is a critical component of what universities have to deal with, and we think we're going to be able to do it a lot better. When the governor got out there in his press conference, again, he was talking up the DEI angle of this, that there are accreditors out there that essentially require the schools they accredit to be pursuing DEI strategies. And he said, we don't ever want Florida institutions to be between the rock and the hard place of the accreditor and state law. That's a very valid concern. But um, the people who are actually down in the weeds on accreditation that I talk to frequently, they're much more excited about the prospect of having a process that can eliminate a lot of the hoops that they have to jump through currently.
Yeah, I mean, very obvious. This accreditation process allows this outside entity to impose essentially whatever criterion it wants on your school. It's like you can't access federal money without us. You have to do what we say. And there's a million of these little choke points in the system that force institutions to behave in certain ways. And so looking to eliminate those choke points, I think, is important. And competition is good. As you say, when you have a monopoly, you end up with a situation where it becomes a bloated, inefficient, very costly process. Maybe if there's more competition, it's going to become a better process. The
Yeah,
one,
that's a
uh,
great point. I'll just say, our hope is that the mere existence of this organization will be a deterrent to some of the other accreditors from imposing onerous standards on their institutions. Now, neither Florida nor any of the other founding systems is going to force its schools into this new accreditor. We are telling all the schools in our system, you're free to stay with the Higher Learning Commission if you like, and once you get in there, or any of the other accreditors, of course, that they do have to leave SACS according to our current state law. But any of the others that will take them, if they think that's the better option for their school, then they can make that choice. But we think that having this option is going to be something that encourages the other accreditors to be more sensitive to those kinds of concerns that I've mentioned already. Just to give you one other example of this, and this is not something that you would ever hear in a gubernatorial press conference, but anytime, and because I went through this process a lot as well at my previous university. It was also accredited by SAC COC, and so I went through these cycles of reaffirmation every so often. And just in the ordinary operation of the university, if a department wants to create a new major, for example, bring a new degree program before the curriculum committee and then get approved and start offering this new degree to students, under the accreditors standards, the librarian basically has a veto power over that. If the librarian comes along and says, sorry, we don't have the resources to support that major, and we're not going to acquire the resources to support that major, that kills the program. So that's the sort of thing that it would probably an unintended consequence, I would say, but it allows these roadblocks to be put up for things that would just be the ordinary operating procedures of a school. And you wind up having to go get permission from the librarian every time you want to have some new certificate or something like that in your academic catalog. So those are the kinds of bureaucratic hoops that we're hoping to minimize.
hmm. Now, obviously, I would assume that the Trump administration is going to be very friendly to certifying their new accreditor. Uh, but let's say
That's the
a
hope.
future Democratic administration is not. What's the situation there? Could a Democratic, president just pull the plug on your accreditor for whatever reason if they felt like it?
I think it would be very difficult to do that if we have this thing stood up entirely during the Trump administration. There was an executive order that the White House put out in April about accreditation, which directed the Secretary of Education to take actions to facilitate the creation of new accreditors. So that's very good for us, obviously. The Biden administration had essentially instituted a moratorium on any kind of applications for new accreditors. And so for a year or two, things had been in limbo there, and there were other groups that had gone pretty far into that process of trying to prepare to apply for recognition that essentially got squelched. And so they were kind of put in a holding pattern. Um, People in the Trump administration, I think, recognize this need for competition. And so we're in a much different environment now. Our hope is that we're going to be able to get the clock started on this incubation period that we have to have, and then get to full recognition by the department in maybe as early as late 2027, but definitely in 2028 at the latest, while the Trump administration is still in the White House. And if at that point we have gotten full recognition, and we have, say, 15 to 20 institutions, most of which will probably be fairly sizable public institutions that have chosen us as their accreditor and have then dropped their membership with SAC-COC or the Higher Learning Commission or whoever it might be. I think it would be politically very difficult for a future administration, Republican or Democrat, that was of a different way of thinking to try to retroactively go back and get rid of the CPHE. They would have to, I think legally it could even be kind of dicey, but politically it would be disastrous for them, I think, if they tried to do that, if we were already up and running and administering financial aid, federal financial aid, and so on.
Yeah, and that would just also green light a Republican president yanking the charters of the cartel. They could just, well, you
Yeah,
guys are out of
that's
business.
right. I mean, that could precipitate like the
Yeah,
destruction of the whole accreditation system, conceivably, if something like
yeah,
that were to escalate.
yeah. There's other things going on too. One of them is some type of post tenure review that you've implemented for professors. What is that?
So, for your listeners who are not familiar with the way higher ed works, at most universities, there is what's called the tenure system, uh, under which a professor who has kind of risen through the ranks of the professoriate and has demonstrated a certain degree of excellence in research and teaching and so on can be granted tenure. And what that means is that the um, with a couple of caveats for financial exigency or a couple of other things like that, the professor essentially has a commitment from the university to a lifetime contract. He could be fired for cause, or if the university decides to shut down an entire academic unit that includes that professor, he could be let go. But the idea of tenure is to preserve the academic freedom of that professor, to enable him or her to research whatever questions he's interested in researching, to publish whatever kinds of things he's interested in, to be free in his academic inquiry, essentially, without fear of reprisal from the powers that be. So that's a long-standing tradition in academia. Well, more recently, and going back really 2 or 3 decades, a lot of states have tried to implement some kind of post-tenure review to say there's an incentive, of course, with tenure that if there is no follow-up after tenure is granted, a professor might decide to start shirking his duties, right? He could just be lazy. He could do the bare minimum to scrape by. He might not ever decide to publish anything else, and basically just treat his position as a sinecure that doesn't really demand anything from him. So in an effort to address that concern, a lot of states, I mean, even states like California, have implemented some kind of post-tenure review to check up on tenured faculty occasionally. And that every so often, I think 5 years is kind of a typical interval, tenured faculty would be evaluated. And if they weren't seen as being, productive in terms of their scholarship and teaching and so on, then they would be given some kind of improvement plan. And to put some teeth in this, some states might say maybe your um, something about your compensation might be tied to post tenure review. Like you might not get a raise if you this year if you didn't do do well on your post-tenure review. Well, a couple of years ago, Florida implemented a statewide post-tenure review. This had been going on at individual institutions for a while, but the legislature implemented a uniform policy across the state. And the new thing about this policy is that a professor who was given um, the lowest rating in post-tenure review could actually be fired. So that was a kind of a new wrinkle, and other states weren't really doing that. So this, as you might expect, caused a lot of hand wringing, among the professoriate. There was a lot of sky is falling rhetoric. The first round of post-tenure review was done in after the 23-24 academic year. There were something like 800 or 900 faculty evaluated, and of those 800 or 900, 10 of them roughly got that lowest rating and were terminated. So it was demonstrated that there were some teeth in this process, and this has been kind of a talking point for a lot of academics since then to say, well, this is going to scare away good faculty. They won't want to come and teach in Florida if they think that Big Brother is looking over their shoulder and they might get a bad PTR score. And of course, the argument here is that, these researchers, I mean, they're probably plenty good in terms of their actual scholarship, but the villains in Tallahassee might have ideological reasons for giving them bad reviews and so on, or whoever is in the upper ranks of the administration at their school who's evaluating them might want to get rid of them because of ideological reasons, and so give them low rankings. So that's kind of the talking point. And just recently, there was an article published by a couple of researchers at the University of Southern California. It's a working paper. It hasn't undergone peer review or anything like that. It hasn't been officially published. But they made this argument that there was, in fact, a brain drain from Florida's universities as a result of this brand new post-tenure review policy. They made the case that after only 1 year of implementation of this policy, after only 20% of Florida's tenured faculty had been reviewed, researchers were fleeing the state out of concern over this policy. So that was an argument that didn't really smell right to me, and I dug into it a little bit more and thought that there were a number of holes in that argument. So I wrote a rebuttal to it. This working paper, which had been posted on one of the scholarly websites that houses a lot of working papers, thousands of them. But this particular paper had been the subject of a kind of puff piece by one of the major higher education websites out there, Inside Higher Ed. And so in June, they published this article about this working paper, and all of a sudden, our office is getting these emails from people who had read this Inside Higher Ed article saying, see, aren't you going to get rid of post-tenure review now? It's obviously a failure. It's backfired, all of this kind of language. And so that's kind of what prompted me to go dig into this thing. And when I wrote this rebuttal to the paper, I sent it into Inside Higher Ed, and we said, like, this is a response to this article that you published. We'd appreciate it if you would publish this rebuttal in your op-ed section. Well, Inside Higher Ed's policy is to respond within 2 weeks after you send in a piece like that. They sat on it for almost 3 weeks before sending me kind of a form letter rejection saying, thanks, but no thanks, we're not going to publish this. And so we ended up just publishing it on our own, the Board of Governors website, the state agency's website. And then that was just yesterday, really, that happened. And we're already starting to see a couple of pieces being published online about that response. We thought it was kind of irresponsible for Inside Higher Ed to run what we considered kind of a hit piece on Florida and then not allow us to respond to it. And so my boss, the chancellor, actually told Inside Higher Ed, we're not going to respond to your media requests anymore. And the reporter who covers Florida for Inside Higher Ed is kind of up in arms about that and complaining on Twitter about it and go telling all his friends who are now writing articles on friendly sites to him that big bad Florida is squelching honest journalism and that sort of thing. That's the kind of environment that Florida Higher Ed operates in. over the last 3 or 4 years, it's kind of been under the microscope, and all the usual suspects are writing hit pieces, even though the outcomes of Florida's university system are the best in the country. We've just been given the #1 ranking by U.S. News and World Report for being the best state for higher education for the 9th year in a row. So I think there's a lot of frustration in other quarters about how well Florida has been doing without necessarily towing these ideological lines that some of the elite opinion makers want us to toe.
Yeah, it does seem to me that it's not like there's a million tenured faculty openings out there around the country that somebody who didn't like your policy could just get another job. I mean, those are hard to get jobs. And except for the absolute top scholars, I can't imagine the majority of the people who are in Florida, professorships actually have the option to go anywhere else. They're probably not going to get. They're probably not going to get another job in another state again, unless they're in some high demand area or they're a top AI researcher or something like that. At which point they got nothing to worry about their job anyway.
Yeah, I mean, we're in an environment where every couple of weeks, an article gets published about another college that's closing somewhere, or a college that is severely downsizing its academic program offerings and its faculty because of declining enrollment and financial problems and all this sort of thing. And it's been a complaint of people looking for jobs in higher ed for more than a decade, that these tenure lines are just disappearing in a lot of areas. So the ironic thing is that these researchers at USC, um, their own numbers told them that this so-called brain drain from Florida was happening entirely in non-STEM fields. So the people that you just said would maybe have the option, top performers in AI research or something like that, who might be able to write their own ticket anywhere in the country. Those aren't the people who are leaving Florida disproportionately, according to their own numbers. It's going to be people in the humanities and the social sciences. And so part of my response to this study was simply to say, look, a lot has changed in Florida over the last 3 or 4 years. We've had this gen ed reform, we've had this DEI prohibition, we've had all these other things happening, and to look at even if it's right that there's more churn in Florida than there was before, to chalk that up to post-tenure review just doesn't pass the smell test really. And so I think it's another one of these kind of motivated reasoning opinion pieces that end up getting a kind of gloss of um, regression theorems and so on to give it a little bit of academic lipstick, and then try to get it out there for political reasons.
Well, I want to have one last topic. Maybe we'll hit it relatively briefly here. Just hit the highlights, and that is you mentioned cost cutting and bloat and efficiencies in what you're trying to do there. And it's obvious that higher ed institutions are massively bloated. We see all the articles about administration. Here in Indiana, when our former governor, Mitch Daniels, became the president of Purdue, he just started cutting things right and left. So, one of the things he told me, for example, was that every dining hall had its own unique recipe for house made blue cheese dressing. And he's like, we want to have good food here, but like, can we just settle on just one type of house made blue cheese dressing? And there was just a million things to save money on. What are you finding that's in terms of efficiencies?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It was kind of much ballyhooed back in January that Florida was going to get its own Doge to run kind of parallel to Elon Musk's Doge in Washington. Now, that's a program that's being run directly out of the governor's office, and the universities are a primary kind of target of that program. And so the governor's office early in the year kind of put together a long list of things that they wanted the universities to report. Everything from, you know, personnel, like what's your administrative FTE per student, that kind of thing, the ratios. facilities usage, how efficiently are your facilities being used, how often, your classrooms, for example, how many hours during the week are your classrooms occupied on average, being involved in academic activities, all sorts of things that Doge, the Florida Doge, is requesting from the universities. And it's not just the universities, every state agency was tasked with creating its own Doge team and doing kind of an internal audit looking for efficiencies. And so even though the Board of Governors is a very small agency, we have maybe 65 or 70 employees in this agency. And even so, we were told that we had to have a Doge team. We had to go through our own budgets and look for all these things. And so I was put on that Doge team, and we spent a few months kind of combing through line items in the budgets and all that sort of thing, looking for efficiencies and finding a few things here and there. But the results of that canvas of the universities is supposed to come in this fall sometime, and then that Doge team operating out of the governor's office is supposed to evaluate all that and make recommendations for the next legislative session in 2026 to see if any changes would be made. Now, my expectation and my boss's expectation is that Florida's universities, by and large, are not nearly afflicted by academic or administrative bloat as schools are in a lot of other parts of the country. Florida higher ed sort of had its come to Jesus moment about 10 or 12 years ago on that front. And there were a lot of changes made at that time. There was a completely new system of what's called performance-based funding that evaluates the universities on specific metrics that determine whether it's going to get its full legislative appropriation for the upcoming year, depending on how efficiently it's operating in a number of different ways and how well its graduates are doing in the job market and all sorts of things like that. And so I think we did our own internal study of the system and found that when you look at the administrative personnel across the system, we're operating at kind of well below average on a per capita basis to universities elsewhere. And so I think that when they come in this fall and look at all those numbers, they're probably going to find something that they can trim here and there, but it's not going to be like the systemically bloated kind of thing that you would find if you were to go look at maybe Illinois or a California or a state like that. So that's our expectation. We'll see what happens when they roll out those findings later this year.
Yeah, well, I know you've got a stream of press releases coming out with all the different things that you're doing there, so people can keep an eye on all the initiatives that you have. Again, my guest today has been Dr. Jason Jewell, who's the Chief Academic Officer of the State University System of the state of Florida. We've been talking a little bit about just some of what's been going on there to try to reform and improve the systems of higher education in that state. Again, Jason, thanks so much for joining me.
Enjoyed the conversation.